Hello, Rick. Are you there?
Hi there.
Hi, Rick. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, you sound fantastic.
Oh, very good.
Rick, I really appreciate this. And I'll have you know, you're my second Newfoundlander in a row.
Who was your first Newfoundlander?
Well, my most recent episode featured Scott McCann from Great Big Sea.
Oh, okay.
So you're number two. You want to hear the prestigious list of Newfoundlanders you're joining here today?
Sure.
Well, Sean McCann, as I mentioned,
Yeah.
Davenant Doyle.
Oh, I know Dabnett.
She's
I went to
fantastic.
Afghanistan with Dabnett.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Heather Bambrick.
Who's Heather? Oh, yeah, yeah. Okay.
She's hosting the morning show here at Jazz FM here in Toronto.
Okay, very good.
And Tom Harrington,
Of course.
who
Did he talk about his time as a Sanderling?
yes, absolutely. And yeah, he broke into song, so he was in
Okay, good. I won't be
my
doing that.
backyard. I was gonna see what I could do. But last but not least, and this gentleman actually reached out to ask me to specifically say hi to you, Rick. But I'm speaking of Ken Tizzard.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yes, there's a picture of Ken in the book.
Well, amazing. And Ken, of those guests, Ken was the only one who actually zoomed in because he lives quite a bit away from here, Toronto. But where do we find you today?
But I'm in Toronto. Why am I not in the studio? I
Uh,
I was just zooming because I assume that that's the way you guys are doing it.
no, I tried to get you here, and a certain book publisher, because of course you've got a fantastic new book we're going to talk about. But I was told to Zoom he asked for Zoom, so yes.
Oh, maybe
I
it's
thought
because there was a bunch of stuff happening today.
I actually thought you were in Newfoundland.
Well, I was, and now I'm in Toronto. I bounce back and forth a bit.
Get your butt over here. I have gifts for you if you show up. But
Where are you located?
Southwest, so like right just beside Mimico,
Okay,
kind of
gotcha. Anyway,
south.
we're here now.
We're here now.
This is the new way.
This is this is better than no conversation with Rick Mercer, that's for sure. My friend, I would consider you a very private guy. I always thought you were a private guy, but you here you are opening up
Yeah.
in a new book, and you're making your Toronto Mike debut. I would argue if you're trying to be a private guy that you're doing it wrong.
Well, I don't know if yeah, I guess I always was a private guy. I just was a guy. I was always in the public eye ever since I was a pretty young man, since I was like in my 20s.
Right.
And I just never talked about my personal life.
But
If I,
go ahead.
if I was doing interviews, I would, and I've done hundreds of interviews over the years, and I was always willing to talk about whatever they wanted to talk about. But if someone just threw a wild card question out there, like, what kind of car do you drive?
Right.
Or where do you like to travel? I'd be like, oh my God, that's very personal. That was just the kind of person I am. But and I'm not a very reflective person, but you have to talk about your life and you have to reflect on things if you're going to write a memoir.
Right. So the memoir is called Talking to Canadians. I actually have it here. I've been reading it, and it's excellent. And I see the date it's available is November 2nd, and this episode is going to drop on November 1st. So people can grab this thing tomorrow.
That's right. Or they can go to rickmercer.com and they can pre-order if they want. And that'll take you to whatever kind of bookstore you like to shop at. But they should be on the shelves tomorrow. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Amazing timing here. Perfect. Now, Rick, you're too young to be retired. I mean, you're not much older than I am, and I can't imagine retiring at this point in my life. So, uh, do you consider yourself retired?
No, because I just wrote a book. I kind of retired or I stepped back from television. I had a weekly TV show, the Mercer Report, for 15 years. It was time to wrap that sucker up because for a bunch of different reasons. And at the same time that I wrapped it up, of course, the TV landscape is changing dramatically. And I just wasn't in a rush to embark on another TV project. And I still don't know if I am. And I don't know what that would look like. And I don't know if it would be on a network. And I don't know what a network is anymore. I mean, there's
Right.
a lot of questions, right? When it comes to show business that way, if you're in my field.
Right.
So, but I can also do things that I haven't had the opportunity to do for the last 20 years, a podcast or write another book or go back to the theater. There's lots of options.
Keep your options open. That's the key here.
Yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned that, like, what is TV? Like, sometimes I'll say, hey, let's watch television, and I think kind of an antiquated term. Like, we grew up, you watch television, but now you're basically choosing what to kind of push to that big screen in the living room. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's changed so dramatically. When you were a kid, and even not that long ago, people would say, "Oh, on Thursdays I watch this show, or on Fridays I watch that show." Kids today, I mean, I hate to be the guy who just said kids today, they just don't get that. There are some things, sports is still something that people make appointment viewing to watch, obviously. Live events like a Juno Awards or what have you, people make, an appointment to watch. And I was really lucky with the Mercer Report because we were one of the last shows standing that families watched. Adults watched it, but people liked to imprint Canada on their young children, so they had their kids watching, and even teenagers. A lot of teenagers would watch the show. So I could go to a university campus and get 1,000 students out for an event, and but most of my mail came from 8-year-olds. It was weird.
Did you write back? I just read on Reddit, actually, there's like a post, somebody said, when they were like 8 years old, they drew a picture of the Queen and they sent it to, Buckingham Palace or whatever. And they got a reply, not from the Queen, but from like the Queen's number lady in waiting or whatever the term is. And,
Right.
like, would you reply to an 8-year-old who sent you
Oh, I replied to a lot over the years, although I'm loath to say that because I'm afraid that some of them might have fallen through the cracks. But oh, absolutely. Especially kids, you would absolutely. The adults who wrote you to say, sometimes if adults wrote and they say they hated the show and why don't you shut up and blah blah blah, I would answer back and say, so you don't want the free mug then? And then they would email and say, yes, I would like the mug. Here's my address. So, but yeah, I would try to answer the kids, certainly.
Sweet. Now, speaking of the live events, you just referenced some live events. One such would be, well, now they're called Canadian Screen Awards, but we used to call them Gemini Awards.
Yeah.
Like, did you keep all 25 of your Gemini Awards?
Well, you don't throw those things out, but I don't have. I have 2 Canadian Screen Awards behind me, and I've never had any paraphernalia to do with show business in my office before. And I kind of put those up because I knew I was going to sell the books, and it was suggested that I put some shiny things behind me, so I did.
Well, Rick, to sell the books, I'd have all 25 there, just like surrounding you, 25.
Oh yeah, sure. Nothing classier than that.
You might have the record for most Gemini Awards won by an FOTM, which you now are, a friend of Toronto Mike. So it's now
good.
Official. It's a good thing. My friend, we're going to take us back a little bit. Again, the book is called Talking to Canadians, and you can go to rickmercer.com right now to pre-order. But if you waited a little bit before you got to this episode of Toronto Mike, it's available now, darn it. Just get this where you buy your books. Can we just go back a bit to Show Me the Button, I'll Push It, or Charles Lynch Must Die?
Yeah, that was a one-man show that I performed when I was a very young man. And in fact, how young? That's the cover of the book, was the poster for Show Me the Button, I'll Push It, or Charles Lynch Must Die. I was a very angry young man, and Canada was going through a constitutional crisis over something called the Meech Lake Accord. That's not really important, but this guy Charles Lynch, he wrote a column, and he said, if push comes to shove in Canada and the Confederation, if we ever had to choose between Quebec and Newfoundland, clearly we would get rid of Newfoundland, because not only are they less important, he basically said they're a basket case and we don't need them.
Right.
And so, of course, I was a young man. I went completely ballistic, and part of my show was about Charles Lynch. Hence the title, Charles Lynch Must Die. But Charles Lynch was a wily old guy, and he wrote a column about the fact that I had this play, and he declared that he was the Solomon Rushdie of Newfoundland, and I had put a fatwa on his head, and
Right.
he was, but he wasn't going to back down. He was going to come to the play and sit in the front row, and we ended up appearing on television together and getting in a big screaming match. He was in his 70s. He was a former head of Southern News. He was a war correspondent. He was beloved by many, many Canadians. And suddenly, there I was, 20 years old, just turned 20, on television. He's 74 or something. And we're yelling at each other about, of all things, Canada's constitution. And it was peak CBC, of course, and it sold tickets like hotcakes. And my show ended up touring the country, and Charles would graciously appear on the radio or television wherever I was playing. We would get into this big yelling match over and over again. We basically created a dog and pony show, and it sold tickets wherever we played. And I owe him a great service for that. And then eventually he got quite sick, and I was playing in Vancouver. And he said, I heard that he had cancer and he was really unwell. So I called him up and I said, I'm dropping the title. The show's no longer called Charles Lynch Must Die. And he said, why in God's name would you change the title? I said, well, Charles, you're dying. And if you die, it's going to be front page news all over Canada. And I'm going to have posters all over Vancouver that say Charles Lynch Must Die. I think that's in pretty poor taste. And he said, how long is your run? And I said, 5 weeks. And he said, okay, I'll wait 5 weeks before I die, but don't take down those posters. So I didn't. And as luck would have it, he lived for a couple of years after that. And I was in television at the time when he finally passed away. And when he did pass away, one day in the mail, the bulletin came from his church service, from his funeral. And attached to it was a sticky note, and written in his hand was, Dear Rick, for your files, regards, Charles Lynch. And he wrote that and gave it to his son and said, when I die, stick it to the church bulletin and send it to Mercer. So eventually he got the last laugh. But that show launched me. It turned me into a national figure, and it led to 22 minutes. And I never looked back. So I owe a great deal of gratitude to Charles for that initial column.
Now I'm looking at the photo of the cover photo you referenced of Talking to Canadians. I think you look like a bosom buddies era Tom Hanks. Which, for the record, is meant as a compliment. I just want to make sure.
Of course. There's a fine looking gentleman. Yes. All decked out in the finest clothes from Salvation Army right there.
And this hour has 22 minutes, of course, is as you mentioned. This is where you kind of got your start on television. A couple of questions. So I've got questions I'll sprinkle in throughout this conversation from listeners of the show, FOTMs, who love sending in questions for guests like yourself. Mal Furious just wants to know, what's your relationship like these days with Kathy Jones?
Kathy Jones and I go way, way back. In fact, Kathy gave me one of my first jobs in the theater, working on a very brilliant one-person show that she did that toured the country. She was a real inspiration for me. I worked with her for many, many years on 22 Minutes, and we shared countless laughs. But I think what your listener is referring to is she's quite a vocal anti-vaxxer. And, I don't prescribe to any of her beliefs. I think she's misguided, and I think it's unfortunate that she's using her public platform to share medical advice, because I don't want to alarm anyone, but she's not a medical professional, nor is she a scientist. So, but to be fair, I haven't spoken to her in quite a while.
But this is something many Canadians are grappling with. I mean, the member of the family who is a staunch anti-vaxxer, and maybe.
Oh, sure. And you know what? That's exactly it. I don't have anyone in my immediate family that is an anti-vaxxer, but I, of course, consider Kathy as one of the family, because I have been, we worked together for so long. So she is that person in my family that doesn't believe in it. And now, of course, those people have turned it into a human rights issue. But I just know from watching certain individuals, I mean, first it started out that there was no COVID, and then they agreed, okay, maybe there is, but it's being caused by 5G. And there's none in the third world because they don't have high speed. Oh, it's in the third world. Well, that's because it's being caused by something else. And the conspiracy theory, or the theory, just changes moment to moment to moment to suit the situation. I mean, it doesn't exist until, the bodies are piling up, and then they admit, oh, okay, it does exist, but it's caused by something else. I mean, it's obviously very frustrating. I get my medical advice from my neighbor, who's a doctor. Smart fella.
Good. I'm just glad you said is a doctor there. I was like, okay,
yeah.
That's great. But you're lucky. You have no. I don't actually have an anti-vaxxer in my immediate family either. But I can just imagine how difficult it would be to kind of maintain a relationship with somebody who's that far out there with the conspiracy theories, and kind of picking that hill to, bad pun, maybe bad analogy, but to die on. It can't be easy for those who have.
I think it's certainly tearing families apart, and Yeah, it's very must be awful. There's a lot of people out there that have that. And of course, anytime families get torn apart, it's awful because there's always children involved and other relatives and grandparents and all this business. Yeah, it's not a very pretty picture. That said, I'm pleased with the vaccination numbers, and I think I'm really happy knowing that most people are vaccinated. I'm like everyone else. I just go, I'm just getting used to using this vaccine pass, and it's very frustrating and irritating, and you have to keep calm about it because you don't want to be rude at a restaurant or what have you. But it is like the Twilight Zone. But so much of the last 18 months, 2 years has been like the Twilight Zone. So it's just one more thing, and it's something that's going to help keep us all healthy.
Right. And so this hour is 22 minutes. Then there's Made in Canada, talking to Americans. And that you mentioned the Rick Mercer report, that was 15 seasons, as you said.
Yeah.
A few, like so many comments. I'm just going to cherry pick a few because we could spend an hour just running down this type of sentiment. But Leslie Ann says, I miss the Rick Mercer report. Then Brian Dunn, basically, he goes, I really just want to know when we'll see him on TV again. I miss him. Then High Sturdy chimes in with, I miss the Rick Mercer report. Will he ever do another show like that again, or has that ship sailed? What can you say to those who think that you might have ended this thing a bit prematurely?
Well, that's very kind because that's very kind because, of course, it's one of the longest running TV shows in the country, and that was one of the reasons I wrapped it up. But there's a couple of reasons. We adapted as the show evolved. For many years, I was involved in a lot of different stunts, and I started thinking that I was getting a little long in the tooth to be throwing myself out of airplanes. We couldn't do the show now anyway. The amount of travel that I did. I've had emails from people who've been watching me in reruns during the pandemic, and they say it's so strange. You've got like hugged, 75 people and shaken hands with about 100, and we're only 10 minutes into the show. And I would travel to two different locations every single week. So it would be very hard to do it in pandemic or post-pandemic times. If I do TV again, and I do love it, it's my first love. This is what the book is about. It's about my love affair with creative endeavors, but mostly with television. And I can't see not doing it again. And I can't see not continuing on with what the kind of mandate or the idea behind the Mercer Report was to celebrate the country. And I'm not saying that there's not parts of our history or parts of our country that aren't deserving of criticism and gazing at, but we decided to focus on the positive and celebrate the country everywhere we went. And I think if I did another show, I would probably carry on in that vein.
And I did read a press release that we will see you on our televisions at the end of this, like literally the end of this year, right? Because you're tell me you're doing something New Year's Eve.
Was there a press release? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, then I guess I guess I got the job.
Oh,
Yeah.
so
I've
this wasn't showing up for you?
I've hosted New Year's Eve a number of times over the past couple of years. It's really, it's always a great night. It's one of those events that people do turn to live television on New Year's Eve. So it gets a great big audience. I've done it from Newfoundland. I've done it from Prince Edward County. I'm not sure yet where I'm doing it from this year, but we bop around the country like only the public broadcaster can. It's always a good night. Yeah. Great music too.
So this is just to be clear to everybody, and I believe it's public info. I feel like when it gets to me, that means this is deemed public info. But the New Year's Eve countdown, this is going to be on obviously New Year's Eve from 11 p.m. to midnight. I can get a guess that's like an Eastern time because Toronto's the center of the universe. I'm not sure how that works exactly.
Well, it would be 11 p.m. till midnight everywhere.
Right.
Like what time I start doing
it's not
it.
live. Okay, I got
No,
you.
well, it will be live to your.
Right.
I mean, some of it will be live to live, completely live, but other will be fed into the time zone.
Gotcha.
That's the magic of television. When you do New Year's Eve in many places, you don't have quite as many time zones to deal with. It's a bit of a math problem.
That's right. Now, as I now look at you on the. We're zooming in because somehow we miscommunicated and I didn't get you in the backyard or the basement, but that's okay. Next time. I realize I'm very underdressed. You are dressed very sharply. You got is that a suit you're wearing there? What's going on?
Well, from here up, no, it's a white shirt and it's called a jacket.
Okay.
It's just, that's I've always worn a jacket on television. I think it has to do with my age.
Well, here I am in my t-shirt, my Lost
Well,
Indies
listen, it
t-shirt.
works for you. There's nothing wrong with wearing a t-shirt. It's just I started wearing a jacket at day one, and then you
Right.
just get stuck with it.
Well, that's your brand, and this t-shirt, that's my brand, is what you're
There
telling
you
me,
go.
which
That's
makes
exactly
sense.
right.
We lost Canada lost a great stand-up comic recently, and I'm wondering if you cross paths with Norm Macdonald.
I did, not nearly as well. I mean, many people that I worked with who wrote with me on the Mercer Report were of Norm's vintage, and they're stand-up comedians, so they worked with him very closely over the years, in the early years when Norm was touring Canada, etc. But I did cross paths with him at Canadian Screen Awards that he hosted, in fact, and then we corresponded for a while about real estate of all things, ridiculous, because I guess he heard through the grapevine that I was the type of person who paid attention to these things, and he was looking for a cottage, and I was trying to convince him to buy a cottage in Newfoundland. But he was that was a huge loss because he was a true comics comic, and by that I mean comics really truly adored him, and there's always been comics that have played only to the comics at the back of the room. Those comics generally don't succeed because by doing that they alienate the audience. But Norm was able to build a huge audience and still play to the comics at the back of the room. And there'll never be anyone like him, and there was never anyone like him before he came along. He was a complete original, and one of those guys that obviously loves stand-up comedy. So many people in stand-up comedy, they're looking for an off-ramp. David Letterman was one of the greatest stand-up comics, but the minute he got the TV show, he never did stand-up ever again, other than a
Right.
monologue. But he never went out on the road or anything like that. There's always been those people. Nothing wrong with that, but they're looking for an off-ramp. But there's other stand-ups that are true, pure stand-ups that it doesn't matter what level of success in movies or TV or whatever comes along, they're still first and foremost stand-ups, and they always continue to return. And Norm Macdonald was one of those guys.
And I know you've done your fair share of stand up, but it's when you talk Norm Macdonald, you mentioned he had that great split where he was the comics comic who still made it big. Like he's in movies and he's on
Oh,
Saturday Night
sure,
Live. But I'm
sure.
thinking of another Canadian stand up who we lost too early, Mike Macdonald, who I would consider Mike Macdonald the comics comic who never was able to parlay that into the screens, be it the big screen or the small screen.
Comics. And I can't presume to talk about Mike, but Mike had tremendous success. He was one of the first comics that played stadiums, and he did big tours. And I think that there's always this perception in the public that things go a certain way, like, oh, you're a big stand-up comedian, then you'll get a sitcom,
Right.
and that'll work. Well, that's happened for some stand-ups, but that's it's not like there's a magic formula and that's how it's going to work for everyone. And so sometimes then people perceive, oh, that didn't happen, then that there was a failure. I've had people say to me over the years, but you never made it in the States, did you? As if that's a failure. And I don't obviously begrudge anyone who goes to the States, but I didn't have to, so I didn't. And I don't perceive that as a failure, but in some people's eyes they might. And there's always been big stand-ups that because Steve Martin was a big stand-up and became a movie star, they expect every big stand-up to become a movie star. It doesn't work that way. A lot of stand-ups can't act. Steve Martin can act. He had two different skills. So it's just one of those things. I think Mike had tremendous success and a tremendous influence on so many comics. I mean, I can't even tell you how fondly that Canadian comedian stand-ups think of Mike.
No, great points, Rick. Absolutely, and it kind of speaks to what do we deem as this big level of fame, like because Mike McDonald doesn't, appear on I don't know Saturday Night Live or on the big screen in a movie. Like we say, oh, he wasn't able to make it, but we know define success. You said he was headlining arena shows. I mean, that
Oh yeah. At one point,
upstream.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
you know what? I think if you talk to anyone in show business, anyone who makes a living in show business, consistently has had tremendous success. I know I could speak for every Canadian in show business that when they, make a living that year, they feel pretty good about it, and they feel that that's a level of success that's something to be very proud of.
No, no doubt. Now I'm going to return to some questions from the listenership. Johnny D. When Rick used to have politicians on his show, which one did he like the least and the most?
Well, I would never answer which one I would like the least. There were certainly some duds. There were certainly some that came along and they just weren't willing to put themselves out there in any way whatsoever because they were being so cautious, and that would just didn't make for good television. And some of the times we didn't put that on television. But I can say that Jean Chrétien had great comic timing. So with him, not only was it a matter of landing a big fish because you were getting the Prime Minister of Canada at the day, you were also getting a guy that had timing like Eugene Levy or something. It was freakish. He was so good at it. So that was good. But also Preston Manning, it was a very right-wing, socially conservative individual. So he and I didn't see eye to eye on very much at all. But I always enjoyed my time with him. And he too had this goofy, strange sense of humor that translated and made for good TV. So I think my job was always I kind of got out of talking to politicians so much because I just felt a little bit uncomfortable with it as time went on. But my job was to make everyone who came on my show look good. And with politicians, I felt it was my job to humanize them to a certain extent and show them in a different light. Bob Rae came on the show. He was running for the leader of the Liberal Party, ostensibly Prime Minister of Canada. I invited everyone running for the leadership, Stéphane Dion, Michael Ignatieff, to come on a fishing trip with me. And none of them would do it except Bob. And then I thought, well, this is going to look weird if I just take one. But then I thought, shag it. Ignatieff won't go. We'll go with Bob. We went on this fishing trip in Northern Ontario because the most important thing was we had to catch fish. I wasn't going to have a fishing segment without catching a fish. It's like a fishing show where they don't catch a fish. Terrible. So we went to this beautiful, a friend of mine that has a small plane in Sudbury. And we got in this plane and we flew to these lakes you can't even get to unless you have a plane. You'd have to be an idiot not to catch a fish there. It's just beautiful, picturesque fall. The leaves are changing, just gorgeous Northern Ontario landscape. And couldn't get a fish. And when it was over, this interview was great. The scenics were great, but we never got a fish. And I knew that's all anyone would talk about. How these two idiots went up there and they couldn't get a fish. And so it was suggested that we end the segment by getting naked and jumping in the lake. Now, this is a man who's running for the leadership of the Liberal Party. Right. And he thought about it for about 30 seconds and said, okay, let's go. And we dropped pants and took up all our clothes and jumped in this lake in the fall. But, that spoke to the character of the man and the type of person he is in a way that 1,000 interviews with journalists probably never would. And it will probably be in Bob Rae's obituary, which, please God, won't have to be written for a very long time. Right. But it will be there because it was significant and it told Canadians something very important about him. I mean, I don't know what it is, but I think it was positive.
No, that was one of the most referenced moments when I opened up questions for Rick Mercer. One of the most, and it's funny, really quick aside is that you mentioned, becoming leader of the Liberal Party. That used to mean becoming prime minister at some point, like a slam dunk somehow. But you did mention two names, Michael Ignatieff and Stéphane Dion, who became leader of the Liberal Party and never became prime minister. So it seems like they broke.
And then Bob was interim leader, and they did very, very well as Bob was interim leader. But, this is politics. Right. Bob couldn't beat Michael Ignatieff, and Michael Ignatieff shouldn't have won. He was a terrible politician. That's not his fault. He thought he would be a good one. Enough people thought he would be because he's an intellectual, has written a lot of books, and has traveled all over the world. But he was away from Canada for too long. They just gambled on the wrong horse. Had Bob won at that point, he very much, I think, would have become prime minister. Then when Bob gave it a second shot, he was up against Justin Trudeau. And, that was a horse that you couldn't beat at the time. Right. So, that's politics is like that. You have to be in the right place at the right time. Bob's had a lot of success. He quite often was in the right place, but when it came to the big job, not so much. That's just politics.
And well, it's just politics that Ontario, the vast majority of Ontarians are still angry about Bob Rae's NDP leadership provincially. So
sure.
As you know, you're not electing a Liberal Party, you're not electing a Liberal Prime Minister without, winning Ontario. It's that
was certainly some baggage that Bob had going in. That's no doubt about it. But the whole thing that took Bob down, Rae days, seems quite quaint
Oh yeah.
in the rearview mirror. It seems like, well, that was actually seemed quite sensible. Actually, it seemed
Oh,
fair and sensible at the time. Of course, they did a masterful job of selling it as something disastrous. But I'm not here to defend Bob Ray by any stretch. I just used him as an example. Um, as of a politician who came on the show,
no, and he
and
was fantastic. But you mentioned Jean
yeah,
Chrétien too, and of course, one of the moments everybody talks about with Rick Mercer is going to Harvey's with Jean Chrétien.
well, that was something that you just wouldn't see. It was, well, you can imagine in the prime minister's office, they thought we had completely taken leave of our senses. I was a very young person and I wanted Chrétien on the show. That would be a big deal in it of itself.
Right.
But I wasn't asking for 5 minutes in his office or 2 minutes in the hallway outside his office. I wanted him to travel to me, to the outskirts of Ottawa, to our Harveys, and spend a substantial amount of time to pull off what it is that we wanted to pull off. And he went for it. And it turned out to be a great segment. But just the audacity, it was just no one had seen like a prime minister goofing around at a Harvey's restaurant before.
Right.
And it was, it was masterful on from his point of view, like in terms of his comic timing. It really was tremendous. But also, it was just so strange to see. It was to talk about a guy putting his, letting his hair down. But, he very much was that little guy from Shawinigan. I mean, it was masterful to watch him work. He walked into the restaurant. No one knew we were coming. And this family, they just stared at him like they couldn't believe it. And he came over and he was shaking their hands. And then he said to the little guy who was like 11 years old, he said, "Do you know who I am?" And the kid said, Mom and Dad just told me you're the prime minister. And he's like, "That's right." And then he reaches down and took one of the kid's onion rings and popped it in his mouth and walked away. And I was like, that kid is going to vote Liberal for the rest of his life.
Man.
Right.
Yeah.
And we had to fight to get Chrétien out of the kitchen because there was a lot of new Canadians working in the kitchen. And he was in the back, wanted to know where they were from, how they were enjoying Canada, how they were being treated at Harvey's. It was just like, it was actually masterful to watch him work the room, but we had to drag him out, of course, because we had a job to do.
Sure. Well, another memorable moment, Ken Coward, he's one of many people who brought this up, but Ken Coward wrote, ask Rick about the time he and Rick Hansen went bungee jumping. I'll never forget Rick Hansen yelling, "I can't feel my legs."
Yeah. One of my absolute favorite segments of all time because it had everything that I could consider would make up a great segment. It had beautiful scenery, and I mean, beautiful British Columbia. It's so beautiful. It's like a punch in the face. A great Canadian, Rick Hansen, and action. And we had bungee jumping, and not just bungee jumping, but the fact that Rick Hansen is a paraplegic in a wheelchair. We had it all going on. And he turned out to be such a tremendous guest, and he was a bit of a hero of mine when I was a kid. I did a school project on him and stuff, and sometimes you don't want to meet your heroes, but he was fantastic. And but more importantly, I asked him to do this bungee jump thing, and he was happy to do the show, but he started making noise like he wasn't going to go bungee jumping at all. And I looked into it and I said, there doesn't seem to be any real reason why someone who's in the wheelchair, paraplegic, can't bungee jump. I guess you got to check with your doctor. And he's like, "It's not that. I just don't really want to do it." And it turns out he's terrified of heights. He doesn't like heights, which is a real serious thing. Like my brother wouldn't bungee jump for $1 million, right? I just know that about him. But as luck would have it, that night, a friend of Rick Hansen's that Rick has known his entire life went to his house, and they were having a few pops. And Hansen happened to tell his friend, he said, "Mercer wants me to go bungee jumping on his show, but I'm not doing that." And his friend said, "Yeah, of course you can't do that. You're in a wheelchair." Well, there's Rick Hansen, spent his entire life showing that he can do anything that an able-bodied person could do. And there's an old buddy of his saying, "You can't do that. You're in a wheelchair." So he had no choice. So he got me on the phone and said, "I'll do it." But it was a real struggle for him. Let me tell you, I didn't want to go off either, but he didn't not want to go off the edge of that bridge. In fact, I pushed him off the bridge, which was a great day for me, pushing your hero off a bridge. But yeah, once he was down there, he delivered that famous line, "I can't feel my legs." Brilliant. What a great way to end a perfect piece.
And what a great segue to Al Grego's question for you, Rick. Rick Mercer seems so fearless on his show. He was up for anything, skydiving, bungee jumping, etc. I'd like to know if there was anything that he was asked to do that made him second guess whether or not he could do it.
Oh yeah. Now, one of the things I was always good at was heights, and I knew because of my brother, I mentioned doesn't like heights. I knew that for a big portion of the population, they have a real problem with heights. So if they see someone doing something that involves heights, they think, my God, that person is so brave. They're up for anything. I could never do that because they feel they could never do it.
Right.
So it wasn't that I was up for anything. I jumped out of an airplane, but I was tied to a soldier, you know, they're highly trained soldiers. So
Right.
really anyone could do it. A bag of milk could do it.
Right.
But it always frightened people. But there were things I was afraid to do. And there were things I never did. There's people in Canada, their hobby is, or their sport is they stand on the back of horses, and the horses like do obstacle courses and they like stand there. And every year these people would invite me and I would say, no, I'm sorry, I can't. And after 4, 5, 6 years of turning them down, they started getting insulted. Like, why won't you do this? You jumped out of a plane.
Right.
And I was like, well, I'm sorry. If you jump out of a plane and you're tied to a soldier, nothing bad is going to happen. And but if I'm standing on the back of a horse, I could very well end up as a quadriplegic, and I'm not doing that. And plus, horses make me nervous, and my balance is not that good. So there were things that I certainly wasn't up for. And there were times when I got in over my head. I did this thing called the train of death, and that's three cars chained together. And the first car has an engine, no brakes. The second car has no engine, no brakes. The third car has brakes. I was in the back, the last car. So these three cars are racing around a track. And it's like when you're a kid and you're doing skating, right? Whip it, right?
Right.
And I had to apply the brakes. I didn't know what I was doing. And halfway through our practice run, I really thought I was going to die or I was going to be in a terrible, terrible car crash. And I was never so afraid. And the only thing that went through my mind was, I'm going to be killed. And people are going to go, well, that's terrible. He died. How did he die? And they would say he was doing the train of death. And then they would laugh. Like my death would be a punchline because, I guess it's his own fault. He signed up for something called the train of death. So I started backing off on things that I thought could have fatal consequences.
Well, that would win you a Darwin Award, I believe.
Well, exactly. You don't want your death to be a punchline.
Right.
I was in situations like, going up with the snowbirds, and originally people said, aren't you afraid? And I thought, well, if it comes to an end, that'll be a great Canadian way to go, God forbid.
Right.
But not the train of death. I mean, that's just too absurd.
There's a listener who goes by the handle Sex, Ducks, and Rock and Roll.
Yes.
I should find out what that's about. But he wants to know, and this will maybe tie in with things you might not want to do, if you will, but let's hear what you say about it. He wants to know when you'll run for prime minister.
Well, I've always been fascinated by politics. That's what got me into this business in many ways. I love comedy and I love politics. I figured out a way to merge them. And I think, politics is my sport. It's my baseball. And I think anyone who's a crazy baseball fan, especially say someone who's a columnist or writes about baseball, they always have this, this fantasy that someone's going to come along and say, okay, we've had enough. You come on and, you pitch or you be general manager of the Blue Jays. You try to pull us out of this slump and you go, finally, I will work my magic. So I guess I always had that fantasy in the back of my mind, but I will say I'm less interested now in being in politics than I ever was in my entire life. But I will also say that I think, when you caught me as a young man, I would have said, we need to get rid of all these old guys and get some young people in there. And now I think, there's too many people who have never done anything else. They've only ever worked in politics, and it would be good to get some people who have real life experience in there. But the short answer is not going to happen in
Because
the near or distant future.
there are a couple of television stars, if you will, who are in Trudeau's cabinet right now. I mean, the newest.
Oh, I think the Canada AM, AM cabinet.
Yeah, Sean. Yeah, and Reagan, and well, Sean, Marcy Ian here just got named, and
Yeah.
Rick Mercer for MP. You would dominate, I think.
That's very kind of you to say. But I'd much prefer to write books and do creative things. Right. I used to run for student council in high school, but after I would get elected, I kind of lost interest. I was interested in the campaign and the speeches and the putting up the posters and the organizing, not so much in the planning the dance part.
Right.
Yeah.
Before I get to KCR's question, do you think maybe, and this will be the spec, you mentioned Canada AM. Well, Canada AM is no more, but they have, of course, Your Morning, which replaced it. And Ben Mulrooney recently left the airwaves on Your Morning, the CTV show. Do you think Ben Mulrooney ends up in politics like his father?
He's never ever indicated that he has any interest in that. But I think a lot of people who go into politics don't necessarily have an interest in it until, for some reason, they're driven to do it.
Sure.
Obviously, he would have, he understands it. He knows people who understands it, but he's never. I know him a little bit, not that much, but he's always wanted to do what it is that he says he's going to do, which is try his hand at producing. So I'll take him at his word. That's what I think he's going to do.
Andy Curran would like to know, before I get to KCR, Andy Curran, great musician, by the way, says, I'd like to know if Rick has any fond memories of the episode he did with Neil Peart.
Oh, of course. And if anyone out there is a drummer, they know exactly why, because I was a failed drummer. I took drum lessons when I was a kid, and then I bashed around on a trap kit in the garage, but I realized very quickly I was never good enough, and that wouldn't be a part of my life. But I loved the drums, and we would sit around and listen to Rush records for Neil. And he's arguably one of the greatest drummers in the world. Also famously, I wouldn't say reclusive at the time, but reticent to do any interviews of any kind, or meet and greets. And he was a very complicated figure. He had a really tragic life. He just had a real string of bad luck, a lot of loss in his life. And while he wanted to continue being a professional musician, I don't think he had much time for the other side of it, the meet and greets and the media and all that stuff. So we just threw it out there that he would come on the show, and turned out he was a fan of the show, and he said yes. And it was my God, I played drums with Neil Peart. He played his big kit, I played my little kit. He was a tremendous fellow. We got on like a house on fire, and the interview traveled in ways that most of my interviews, if not any of them, did. We would get emails from Brazil, we would get emails from all over the world, because there's real fascination with Neil, but he just did so few interviews. Like, he only did stuff he was interested in. So it was great. Also, it showed a real sense of humor, and I think people just perceived that there was so much loss in his life that he just must be a very tragic, sad figure. And I'm sure he had his fill of sadness, but he revealed himself to be a really funny guy who was self-deprecating, and a great interview. And I don't think people expected that. So it has nothing to do with me, but that interview constantly is getting played on YouTube or wherever, because of people who really love Neil Peart and love Rush, for sure.
And now that Andy Curran, who asked that question, he's a good FOTM. I just want to shout out his band, Coney Hatch. He's a founding member of Coney Hatch.
Okay.
KCR, he just wants you to speak, and you can handle this as you wish here, but he wants you to speak about Doug Ford, Aaron O'Toole, and the Conservatives. I think he misses the those epic rants that we got accustomed to.
Yeah, I mean, that's a little open-ended. That's a little open-ended, and but Aaron O'Toole, I guess he's going to go, I would think. This was the last election. I don't think the Tories had a hope in hell. I think this election had the Conservatives, put up a leader that was palatable to the country in any way, shape, or form, then Trudeau could have gone down. So I think that the Conservatives, they know this, and I think he's going to have a hard time hanging on to his job. But he's got there's a real existential crisis happening inside of the Conservative Party. This happens in parties sometimes. It wasn't that long ago that Liberals are in third place, but you have such a divide among rural and urban Canadians inside the Conservative Party now that it's hard to form a national government when you have that kind of divide. And they've got some work cut out for them. I can't think of anyone who could make it work as leader of the Conservatives right now. I think they might get lucky, and Trudeau might defeat himself if he sticks around, and then Porky Pig could get elected. But I think right now I don't see that formidable leader on the horizon. And they get bogged down in like every time you turn around, I mean, they're just out there, and it's always the same, right? And women's right to choose, and you know, gays or whatever. It's always the guns. It's always the same thing that takes them down. It's but I understand it's a crisis inside the party.
Which sounds familiar because we hear about the same thing, similar thing happening to the Republican Party south of the border.
Sure.
It's like,
And Doug Ford, of course, has no opposition really. I mean, you have an NDP leader who's been around for as long as I seem to remember
and
in my
has the
life.
aforementioned Bob Ray baggage anyway, right? Which, like, I feel like that Bob Ray baggage we referenced with him becoming Liberal leader exists to
Sure,
haunt
and it's
Andrea.
and it is one of those curses that, like you have to realize. I mean, the vast majority of voters probably have no real memory of that at all. They just
Right,
know they've been told, "Don't ever do that."
right, right.
So they've got their work cut out for them. But you know, I would argue that you know, Doug Ford has no credible opposition, either from the Liberals or the NDP, and you know, that's unfortunate. I don't say that because I'm a fan of either of those two parties, but I believe in a strong opposition. It keeps the government honest, and you know, again, I think a credible candidate uh, could cause real trouble for Doug Ford, but I don't see any real trouble on his horizon.
Nature, and that is the name of this particular person. Nature asks, did he ever watch an episode of Schitt's Creek?
Oh, sure, sure, tons of them. Yeah, tons of them.
Yeah,
Because I was traveling a
yeah.
lot, and they were on the plane too, so it was a real pleasure to be able to watch them on the plane. You know, Dan is obviously you know, incredibly bright guy who created this show that just captured the imagination of the entire world, but certainly America. And you know, Catherine and Eugene are Canadian comic royalty for very good reason. I mean, these are two of the most beloved Canadians in show business by a long shot. So yeah, absolutely. And Emily Hampshire, I worked with on Made in Canada, and she was also great on the show. Yeah,
Absolutely. Viraj Dave says, would you consider doing a documentary series for CBC Gem?
sure. I don't know what, you know. I've always thought of
Right.
doing docs at some point. I don't know what that documentary would be about. And then once I figure that out, maybe I'd go out and figure. I mean, the way TV works is then you go out and try to get a broadcaster, and certainly they would be on the list.
Well, I just watched the first episode of this new season of Curb Your Enthusiasm, and it opens with basically Larry David is pitching a show to Netflix, and I imagine you know, you have this idea for a show, you have, you know, you have these certain places you get to because you're Rick Mercer, they'll take your call and you can pitch them. This is how I envision it anyways.
Yeah, that's exactly how it would work. And yeah, I hope that people would still take my call. Let's
I,
see.
I
I
could
certainly remember when they wouldn't, so
all
we'll
right.
see.
I'm pretty sure they'll take your call now, that's for sure. David McPherson, who's my next guest, because he just wrote a great book about Massey Hall, the history of Massey Hall.
Ah, yes, I just went to order that online yesterday
Hey.
because I noticed that well, I saw the book,
Mhm.
and that Jan Arden did the intro.
Right? Yes,
So
exactly. Sorry.
yeah,
So he's you know, I thought you were in Newfoundland. Okay, so he is nearby. He's I think he's in Waterloo. But anyways, David McPherson's making the trek to my home studio here, and he's got the obvious question, and I'm interested to hear you comment on this. He wants to know if you ever performed at Massey Hall.
I didn't play Massey, and you know, I played some big rooms in Toronto, but I never played Massey Hall. Although you know, I don't really have any. You know, it's kind of like, why would I play Massey Hall? No, there's been some big comedy shows in Toronto, but no, never played Massey. Never.
And I just want to credit Paul Hunter. He wanted you to speak about the Bob Ray getting naked on your show, and he wanted you to chat about how you convinced Bob Ray to do so. But Paul, thank you for that question. We did talk about Bob Ray getting naked in the show. It's because he didn't catch a fish.
Right.
Brian wants to know everything you can tell him about your best friend Jan Arden. You just mentioned Jan, and yeah, you're tight with Jan Arden, who by the way is hilarious. So if Jan's listening, I'd love to get you on Toronto Mike. I think you're very funny. And just for the FOTMs, I believe, and I'm not sure this is public, but I'm going to say it anyway, that Jan Arden is actually going to appear in a movie directed by the great FOTM Stu Stone. So I believe that's going to happen in Winnipeg
Oh,
in November. But what can you tell us about Jan Arden?
Well, she's a good friend of mine. I met her professionally. When we would do the TV show, we often there was no net. Like we'd go out and do to a place. We're going to get a segment, and we needed that segment. Otherwise, we'd have nothing to put on TV. And I can't remember what the circumstances were, but I was in Calgary, and whatever it was we had planned just fell apart. And so we were desperate. We thought, well, I'll do like a guide to Calgary, like the Mercer Report guide to Calgary. But I thought, well, who the hell am I to be telling people what to do in Calgary? Like, I have no voice of authority. I'm not from here. Um, we'll have to get someone to show me around. And I knew Jan was funny from interviews, and I'd never met her. Maybe we'd cross paths and said hello at some thing or something. And I called her up and I said, would you do this? And she said, yeah, okay, I can do that. Like, when do you want to do it? Like, I'll get my calendar out. And I said, oh, like today. She was like, my God, what do you mean today? And I was like, I need it today. And then she's like, okay, where are you? And I gave her the address. She said, hang on. And like literally 20 minutes later, she pulls in her car. She's like, okay, let's do it. She said, on the way over, I thought we could go to the zoo. We could go to Calgary, the Calgary Olympic Park, and go in there and goof around. And I was like, okay, let's calm down. I've been doing this show a long time. You just don't show up at a zoo or Calgary Olympic Park and say, let us in. You need legwork. You got to call in advance. There's always proposals. There's insurance. There's a million things. She said, no, it'll be fine. And everywhere we went, they were like, oh, Jan. They opened the door. And next thing you know, we were doing the skeleton. We were doing the bobsled. We were like, spraying water in a hippo's mouth and painting with elephants. It was just a phenomenal piece. And all we did was laugh the entire time. She just made me laugh the entire time. So she saved my bacon, and she turned out to be a great guest. And she eventually became a regular on a show that fundamentally did not have regulars. Like, we just didn't, except Jan. She was the exception. And then we kind of stumbled on that first segment that people like to see me encourage Jan to do things that terrified her. And so that became a bit of a running gag, and it worked, and people liked it, and we always enjoy each other's company. And she's a great person. She loves animals. She likes animals more than people, and she likes people. She's fantastic. Can't say enough.
And having said all that, she's also a heck of a musician as well.
Oh my gosh, she breaks my heart, and I always tease her about that. She's so funny, and you see her in concert, it's like nothing else. She has everyone like dying, laughing, like tremendous storytelling for 10 minutes, and then she sings a sad song, and she has them dying, laughing again. Then she goes, now even sadder song, and that's the way the night goes, and it works. She's tremendous.
Amazing. Now, a few people had similar sentimented questions here, so I'll just do a couple to cover it. But of course, your book is called Talking to Canadians, and people are referencing Talking to Americans. And Kevin, for example, says that you are one of the best ever people to be at the CBC. That's what Kevin says. He says,
that's very kind.
Yeah, and that's a tall order. A lot of great people have been at the CBC. Would you do a Talking to Americans series? And he's saying specifically at Trump rallies, and Dave Carson also chimed in to say he would love to see Rick cover a Trump rally. I think the whole idea that Rick Mercer covers a Donald Trump rally is just something that people would absolutely love to see.
Well, that's very kind of him to say. And God, I don't know if I could handle going to a Trump rally. I guess professionally I could. Right. Talking to Americans was so big, and the special was so big, and the numbers were so big that everyone wanted me to do another one. And I decided not to do another one because I thought I was at risk of it becoming what I did. And I didn't want to just do that. So I stopped. It's hard to stop something when it's working, hard to walk away from a show just because you think it's time and no one else does. But I did it. And every time there was a change in leadership at the CBC, and it happened probably 6 or 7 times, I would get a call from them. They'd say, I have an idea, Talking to Americans too. And I would politely decline. And I don't think it would work the same way that it did back in those days. Those days were pre-YouTube, believe it or not. And I had a lot of fun. In the book, I talk a lot about Talking to Americans, right, because there's really fun backstage stories, I think. And I talk about the genesis because it was a total fluke. And, we ended up shooting with governors. Mike Huckabee, who ran for president, thought that our Parliament building was melting because it was made out of ice. We had George W. Bush think that Canada's leaders was named Poutine. I mean, there's a lot of stories there. So I talk about that a lot in the book. But short answer is, I don't see that on the horizon by any stretch.
The magic 8 ball says unlikely. Prognosis unlikely. Okay, Social Animals podcast. The handle, I'm sure, is also the name of this gentleman's podcast. Says, what was your favorite question to ask Americans?
Um, I was the most incredulous when I was at Mount Rushmore, and I told people that a Canadian mining company had the rights to mine inside the heads of the presidents, and they discovered plutonium and were planning on going ahead. And should they be required to drill through the back of the heads, because it would be cheaper to go through the foreheads.
Right.
And most people said we should make the Canadians drill into the back of the president's heads. But no one said, no, this is a national monument.
Right.
These are our presidents. You can't drill into their heads. Who sold the mining rights to Mount Rushmore? No, they were just all over the almighty buck. But my personal favorite was when I told Americans that we were considering legalizing insulin. And that was just a personal favorite for me, I think, because my sister's diabetic and I grew up around insulin vials all my life. I just thought that, and the fact that insulin was a Canadian creation, I just thought it was, the height of lunacy that people could believe that in some countries insulin was illegal. But it went on and on, putting the elderly on ice floes, the Toronto polar bear hunts. It just went on and on. We had, we convinced people that we had a national park called Joe Clark's Hole, and we were now offering bilingual tours of Joe Clark's Hole. I mean, it just went on and on. It was just, it was a great gig. It's all in the book.
Do you have any memories of sitting down with a young man named Troy Birch talking about beer?
Now, when did I talk to Troy about beer?
Now, okay, so he was interviewing you. I think it was called TAPS, TAPS.
Okay.
Anyway, he now works at Great Lakes Brewery, which is not too far from where I sit right now here in Southwest Toronto. And Troy sent me a picture of you two chatting, and he has these fond memories of interviewing you. So, firstly, I just want to say hello to Troy Birch, who's a big fan
hello,
of yours.
Troy. And I must have really been BSing, because while I enjoy a glass of beer or a bottle of beer, although I've never been able to say bottle properly, I'm not one of those guys that can wax on about beer by any stretch. So I bet I changed the subject a lot. I bet he asked me, like, do you like the hoppy taste? And I'd be like, well, I tell you one thing about the Prime Minister, I bet you're probably unaware of.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is probably all he wanted you to do anyways. So shout out to Troy Birch. Hey, Jake Gold. You ever heard of a guy named Jake Gold?
Of course, from management of the Tragically Hip, absolutely,
right,
and is currently the management of the Tragically Hip. And Jake and I go way back. When we did Made in Canada, the Tragically Hip provided the theme song for Made in Canada graciously, and Jake was the management at the time. I can't imagine Jake was thrilled with the deal, because they literally gave it to me. I mean, they didn't give it to me, but the money was so low because we didn't have any money. Not only did they give me the theme song, they also allowed me to use any Tragically Hip song I ever wanted, written, produced, or yet to be produced, which I did. So in that universe of Made in Canada, if the radio was ever on in the car, in that universe, there was only Tragically Hip music. And so I was a friend of the bands were friends of mine, and of course Jake's. And Jake's been a great supporter of mine over the years, and he's a great guy. And he's involved, of course, in Road Apples, which is this incredible release of previously unheard Tragically Hip music.
But that Road Apples was the name of the second full-length LP, but this is called Saskadelphia.
Saskadelphia, sorry, yes. And Saskadelphia, so this is tremendous, unheard Tragically Hip music. And I'm in the video for one of the songs with Jay Baruchel, and I got this call, and they were like, we found these tapes, these Tragically Hip songs that no one's ever heard before. Will you be in this video? And I said yes immediately. But I kind of, in the back of my mind, was thinking, if these tapes have never been heard, there's probably a reason. Like, they were probably, deemed not good enough. But no, these tapes were lost, and it's an incredible album. It's like a great, great hip album. And Jake, of course, made all that happen. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, well, so Jake, well, firstly, another tie into Jake Gold, of course, is we opened up by talking about Ken Tizzard.
Oh yeah,
And Ken, of course, is in The Watchmen. And
yeah.
Jake did used to also manage The Watchmen as well. So
Yeah,
Jake's a
and
good
Ken
yeah.
Tizzard. There's actually a picture of Ken Tizzard in the book because Ken Tizzard and I were in the same theater program, and we created this show. We were all students of this woman named Lois Brown, and so many people involved in that show. Ken was in the band. What Ken just was just inducted into the Western Canadian Music Hall of Fame. So many people that were in this small group were heavily influenced by this educator, Lois Brown. Went on to have creative lives. Andrew Younghusband went on to become one of the most successful TV hosts, doing Canada's Worst Driver and the Tall Ship Chronicles, etc. Don Ellis, my buddy, does sound design for Stratford Theatre. Like we were all heavily influenced by this educator, and Ken was one of them. But and
Right. So
those were pretty crazy times, let me tell you.
well, I still listen to The Watchmen. Like
Sure.
I love the hip, I love The Watchmen. So Jake Gold was involved, and he was also involved. If I think maybe now or then, maybe both, but The Pursuit of Happiness as well. While we're covering these things.
Not that long ago, because I did an event with the Pursuit of Happiness
Yay!
a couple of years ago, and oh, my phone is ringing.
Is that Jake?
It's
You think that's Jake?
Is he in Edmonton? No, this is like I don't know who this person is. This is one of those stupid calls where
Oh
they're
no.
threatening to arrest
I'll
me.
tell him you're almost done, but you still
No,
have
I
a
just hung up. I
okay.
don't.
Okay, so Jake Gold's question, of course, he wanted to at me to ask you about being in that Tragically Hip video, which you just spoke about, but he has a second question. Could you talk about kissing Emily Hampshire in episode 1 of Made in Canada?
Okay, first the Tragically Hip thing.
Sure.
Talk about a phone call that you never think will happen. I mean, it was 2 years after Gord Downey tragically passed away. On the list of things that could possibly happen in your life, you're not going to get a call from Jake asking, would you like to be in a Tragically Hip video? So it was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. Never mind that Jay Baruchel and his wife were in it as well. Kissing Emily Hampshire. Yes, she played the very first episode of Made in Canada. Emily Hampshire played my boss's daughter, and we're making out on the boardroom table. It was that kind of show. And she was very kind and gentle with me because I didn't really know what I was doing when it came to kissing the young women, but she was very, very good. And she's a good friend and super talented.
All right, and this is also an interesting segue because the next question comes from Gord. I was actually lucky enough to meet Gord and his husband Tom when they came to the most recent two Toronto Mike listener experiences. Gord says, not sure where Rick went in the book, but he has generally been pretty low key on his homosexuality. Curious about how he decided to thread that needle.
I don't think I ever threaded a needle. My joke used to be how many times you have to come out in this country, because I would get emails and say, like, why don't you come out? And I'd say, please see attached the cover of Extra magazine from 5 years ago.
Right.
Right. It was just it didn't come up a lot on the show unless I was making a joke about my personal life, and I was never very good at making jokes about my personal life, mostly because I'm not that type of person. But I talk about it in the book, and I did get pulled into anti-bullying initiatives when I was on the show, and I talked about the need for visible individuals, to be out and gay, because and I wrote about this in a previous book, that when I was in the closet and I was like 15 years old and I was starting out in comedy with Andrew Younghusband, I can remember clearly being out in front of Andrew's house and he points at a house across the street and he said, you know who lives there? I said, who? And he said, Carl Wells. Carl Wells was the weather guy. And he was a superstar, right? He'd go to the old age homes. He'd go out on the fishing boat. He'd go everywhere, right? Carl, the weather guy, was everywhere. Big star. And he said, Carl Wells lived there. And of course, I was obsessed with anyone on television. I was like, Carl Wells lives across the street from you? And he goes, yeah, he lives over there with his husband. Mom and dad had them over one time for drinks. And I didn't know Carl Wells was gay. And that was such a huge game changer for me, because I thought, Carl Wells, huge star in Newfoundland, works on television. You could be gay. Plus, he's here in the suburbs with his husband, and he's having drinks across the street with Mr. and Mrs. Younghusband. Like, it just seemed to me that it told me everything will be okay. You will be able to figure this out as you move forward. At the time, I didn't have a clue how, but I just thought if Carl can do it, I can do it. So I thought it was important that as a person who's on television, that you be visible in the sense that someone could say, that guy's got that show, he's gay. And just why it's important that we have hockey players or police officers or teachers or anything like that. I think that's important.
Well said. Mohit says, how many camera people were injured while filming his rants over the years?
Well, there was only ever 2 real camera operators for the rants. While I was with 22 Minutes, it was Peter Sutherland. And while I was with the Mercer Report, it was Donald Spence, 2 of the greatest camera operators in the country. And I just don't say that. They are, okay, for the Tragically Hip final concert, Don Spence, who did all those rants, he was Gord's close-up camera. So think, when you're putting a show like that together, that important, that's who you call to be Gord's close-up. But they all hurt themselves occasionally because they had to go backwards, right? So they're going backwards, and quite often it was icy. So I can't tell you how many times, like, suddenly the feet would go out and like the camera would just go up like that, and then you'd hear them go ooh, as they landed flat on their back, protecting the camera at all costs, of course, over their own heads. So they did that. A couple of times I remember Pete hooking himself on a nail as he's going around a corner. It wasn't without danger, but all their digits are in place and they did survive. But generally, it was only 2 camera operators. There were a couple of other people who filled in along the way who were also great, but the vast majority of, like, 98%, were done by those 2 people.
All right. While you're thinking about the rants, Rob wants to know: were they completely scripted, or did you have a central idea and just riff off of that? He says they were brilliant.
No, they were always 100% scripted. In fact, my process was I would write everything about the subject matter, but the thing was it had to be under a minute 30, and the good ones were a minute 10. And so I would just write everything, and then I would just keep distilling it, almost like putting a cow on the stove until you get just 1 cup of gravy. And that's the way I kind of thought of it. And then once I got it to that place, then I would run it. And I would always do it the night before. And then the next morning I would get up and run it. And it was never, I never deviated. I made changes in the field sometimes, but I didn't improv. Also, I had a real responsibility to do everything in my power to make sure I knew the words as well as possible, because Don, or Peter from 22, but Don was carrying, a 45-pound camera and walking backwards under really difficult circumstances, because we were shooting in live alleys. And so trucks would back up, beep, beep, beep. Right. We'd have to cut. Some unfortunate individual who lived in the alley might show up and start talking to me in the middle. We'd have to cut. So there was enough extraneous things that could ruin a take. And it was physically really hard work for Don. And so I felt terrible when I was the reason. And I often was, because that's the nature of performance. But I always felt bad if it was me reaching for a word that made them do a second take.
Well, Canada Kev wants to know if you ever got dizzy tilting your head from side to side doing those rants in Graffiti Alley there.
I didn't tilt my head. Don tilted.
Right, that's right.
I might have tilted once or twice, but never to the point of dizziness. Right. Yeah. No.
I don't actually understand I understand the question, but I'm going to just ask it as is because it's safe enough. But I don't know why it's being asked. But Paul wants to know if you watch Hudson and Rex.
Well, Hudson and Rex, he's asking that question because Hudson and Rex is shot in St. John's, Newfoundland.
Oh, okay.
It's a wildly successful show. I'm not the demographic, but I have a friend who has twin 9-year-old boys, and it's their absolute favorite show. Okay. So there's a very big audience. It's sold all over the world. It's a tremendous success.
I'm missing out. Okay.
And it's created a lot of jobs in Newfoundland. But that's why I was asking, because I think Hudson is the guy and Rex is the dog.
Right, sort of like I mentioned your doppelganger, Tom Hanks. He had Turner and Hooch.
Yes, there's been a few. How about didn't have a sidekick? No.
Okay, now I understand. Okay, Hudson Rex. Is it Paul still? Maybe I'm not sure to give attribute this to, but this person mentions that you went tobogganing with Geddy Lee, so you've been collecting more than one member of Rush along the way.
All three members of Rush were on
Hey.
the show.
And Geddy Lee, who by the way, still a diehard Jays fan. You'll see him at many a Blue
Yes,
Jays home game.
he's hard to miss. Yes.
Well, he
Um,
scores the games. I don't know if you've ever scored a baseball game, but that's pretty old school.
yeah, he came on and did what we call a celebrity tip on the show, and
Hmm.
the celebrity tips I would get like an iconic Canadian to teach Canadians something that everyone should know. Pierre Burton taught us how to roll a joint, and
Wow.
Margaret Atwood taught Canadians how to stop a puck, and Geddy Lee did a segment on toboggan safety
Right.
or
That's
how to toboggan, although he didn't wear a helmet because I wasn't going to allow that because we needed to show the locks flowing in the wind.
right. Right. Love it. YYZ. Oh, actually, he prefers YYZ for some reason. YY. Speaking of Rush, actually, because YYZ, of course, is a Rush song. YYZ Gord wants to know: would it be he would be interested in what news story or news event that you've missed the opportunity to rant about by not having a weekly outlet?
Oh, when I started looking on Twitter the night before, our Truth and Reconciliation Day, and I started seeing these people who I perceived as right-wing trolls. They were saying, the prime minister's plane is in Tofino, and I was scrolling through and I was going, that is like these people. They'll just put anything on Twitter. This is ridiculous. And even though I don't have a show, I've always had a few contacts around, so I sent a note to someone I know is close to the prime minister's office, and I said, there's a few people on Twitter saying the prime minister's plane is at Tofino. That can't be possible on tonight of all nights, is it? And they answered, sadly, that is accurate. And I thought, oh God. And that just really kind of, I wouldn't say it infuriated me, but I thought it was classic Trudeau that he would tell us all that we were supposed to take this time to reflect on this terrible thing. And then he sneaks off and goes to Tofino surfing.
Right.
Ridiculous. That doesn't take part in any of the ceremonies that's happening.
Tone deaf,
Um,
right? Like it's
it's
especially
completely tone
yeah.
deaf. And it reminded me very much of I hosted New Year's Eve on Canada Day. Sorry, New Year's Eve for the Canada, celebrations and Canada 150, and Trudeau was supposed to be on the bill, and then someone said Trudeau's not going to be there, and I said he is. I know he's there because I'll be introducing him, and it's Canada 150. Of course he's going to be there. It's New Year's Eve. They said he's not going to be there, and I said, well, that's impossible. And they said, I know where he's going, but don't tell anyone. I said, well, where's he going? And they said, he's going to the Aga Khan's Island. And I said, you're insane because the prime minister cannot leave on New Year's Eve, Canada 150, and go to the Aga Khan's Island. Plus, they said, I think it would be illegal for him to go to the Aga Khan's Island because Canada gives the Aga Khan so much money. And I was like, you're all nuts. And then I was supposed to shoot with him the day of New Year's Eve, and suddenly a call came in saying, oh, you have to do that shoot 2 days before because he's going to be away that night. And I was like, that's impossible. And sure enough, that's exactly what he did. It turned into a huge scandal because it was widely inappropriate that he go there, and lots of people were telling him, just like the Tofino trip. So something like that happens. Yes, I would have liked to have been on the air to talk about that. Just like I would have been on the air to talk about what I thought was really a ridiculous election call. Like I've seen Jean Chrétien call elections when there's no need to call an election, and somehow with a straight face he justifies it, which is ridiculous. But this was the most egregious. I mean, there was no reason to have an election with 2 years left in the mandate in the middle of a pandemic. It just sent all the wrong messages. Ridiculous. So yeah, yes. Short answer, yes, many times.
No, amazing. I did congratulate you on your many, many, many Gemini awards, but I need to point out to everybody listening that you were also appointed an officer of the Order of Canada, which is a tremendous accomplishment and feat. Congratulations on that.
Thank you very much.
I think actually I think Scott McCann, my last guest from Newfoundland, also was recently named appointed an officer of the Order of Canada himself. So you guys can compare. I don't know, medals. It's a medal, right?
It's a medal, yeah.
It's a medal. All right. My last question for you. You've been amazing, by the way. This has been awesome, and I want everybody to know. There's so much more good stuff in Talking to Canadians, the new book by Rick Mercer, which is available tomorrow in the bookstores, but you can get it right now at rickmercer.com if you're listening to this the day it drops, like many a good FOTM does. So I'm going to ask you just here, Rick, at the end is about you've done your fair share of stand up, and there's been quite many a discussion lately about the new Dave Chappelle Netflix special. So, firstly, have you seen the new Dave Chappelle Netflix special?
No, I haven't, although I've seen most of Dave Chappelle's work.
Right.
So I haven't seen it, so I can't comment on it. Even if I had seen it, I'm kind of loath to comment on other comics' work. I am
Right.
not a critic of theater or music or comedy, in the sense that like I've never ever traded in that dark art of criticism. But I will see it. I know that I will see it, and but I haven't seen it yet.
So I won't ask you to comment on anything specific there, but maybe just a little bit about, and Scott M as well wrote in about this, but your thoughts on, I guess, what we deem cancel culture.
Mm-hmm.
So Chappelle, who does make a statement, one sentence he says, I watched the special, and one sentence is, gender is fact, he says, which, I mean, I just had a conversation with Colin Mockery, who will, fervently and passionately disagree with that sentiment, which is transphobic in nature to suggest that gender is fact. And I guess the question about cancel culture is, because it's one thing to say, I will no longer watch Dave Chappelle's special, and I will not buy a ticket to watch him do stand up because I don't like what he says about trans peoples. But there is a movement to sort of like should he to suggest that maybe he shouldn't be allowed to play Scotiabank Arena because of his transphobic comments. So cancel culture in general. I'm curious what you Rick Mercer, have to say about it.
Well, I don't know whether the term is accurate, but it is the term that we are using in pop culture, because there's a lot of people who claim they've been canceled, or a lot of people claim these other people have been canceled, who continue to sell millions and millions of books or continue to have giant contracts. So J.K. Rowling's, of course, a lot of people say, has been canceled, but yet the street is filled with Harry Potters last night, and the books continue to sell, and the new books, the deals continue to happen. So I don't think it's overnight clean. There have been certainly people who have been canceled overnight, but generally, what they have done is far more egregious than share an unpopular opinion. They've done something criminal in nature. I noticed there was a change in my years on television. I spent a lot of time. We would get emails from people saying, "You're an idiot. You shouldn't say that." And suddenly, we started getting a lot of emails from people saying, "You can't say that, and you should be stopped." And I just think, well, that's weird. Why don't they just, just think that they disagree with my opinion versus I shouldn't be allowed to have an opinion? Of course, I have an opinion. That's what I do for a living. And people are always quick to say, I won't buy tickets anymore. And I think that's exactly what they should do. That's what they should do. Like, don't buy that guy's record. Don't buy that person's book. I see it. Jan Arden doesn't shy away from controversy. And sometimes people I'll see on Twitter, they'll say, well, that's it. I'm never buying tickets to your concert ever again. And Jan will say, don't buy the effing tickets. So I could go on and on about cancel culture, I guess, but
but essentially,
I'm glad I'm out of the opinion business, quite frankly, for the time being.
But even sometimes I think even having a socially progressive and proper, for example, you could have an opinion like you might have an opinion that you think drugs should be legalized so we can offer better support and something like that, and you will find people on the other end of the spectrum who want to cancel you for this outlandish take on recreational drugs. There's always
been a natural inclination,
right,
of people to want to stop people from saying something they disagree with. And we are in a period that certainly, for the longest period of time, there were forces out there that wanted to ban books, that wanted to stop performers, that wanted to go after, limit the ability of certain musicians to sell their records, all of that. And it always came from the right. It came from the Christian right. It came from social conservatives. It came from the right wing. Now, the leading voices asking for certain things to be stopped, books to be removed are from the quote unquote progressive left, although I would argue they're not the progressive left, they're something else. But so things have changed. But that desire to want to stop people from being able to do something, and I would have, I'd have to, I can't, honestly, I can't think of what someone would have to be saying in their act for me to say they're not allowed to play Massey Hall. You know, that's a
Okay.
whole different kettle of fish.
Thanks again for being so generous with your time today. Next time, let's do it in person.
Yes, indeed. I hope so. I hope this virtual thing will soon be a thing of the past. And I hope everyone goes out and gets the book, because in these trying times, you know, I think that I go to the bookstore, I look at the shelf, or I look at the table. It's like, that's dark, that's dark, that's very heavy, that's very heavy. And that's all fine. But I think there's got to be room, especially in these times, in the corner of the table for a funny book. And I hope that's what I delivered.
Thanks, Rick, for this. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Awesome. Honestly, you were fantastic. And this drops right away. Like, I literally will have this on the feed. I don't know if you actively tweet from your account or if somebody does that for
Sure, I
you.
do. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm going to tag you on it and get this out in like 10 minutes because it was amazing.
Okay. That's great.
Can I do a screen grab? Like, so can you pose for a picture and I'll do a screen
Yeah.
grab? Okay.
Yeah.
Here. And then I'll set you free here. Okay. Okay. So 3, 2. All right. Thanks, Rick. That was awesome.
Thank you. All
Peace
right.
and love to you.
Anytime.
Take care.
Bye bye.